Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out locals to get updates on the channel and to continue to support the channel. So, today's discussion for the roundtable is mass shootings. And we've had a few reported in the news today. And what's interesting is that this seems to be this is something I did see that you had done, Keith, on Facebook a while ago. From like 1970 to like 2000, it was serial killers that seemed to be all the rage. Guys that would go around and kill like 10, 20, 30 people over, a 10, 15-year period. Now it seems to be that it shifted, say around 2000, 1999, Columbine, to mass shootings. Now, mass shooting is classified as a shooting where four or more people are killed. A lot of these tend to revolve around schools. Some revolve around things like gay bars and massage parlors we've seen in recent years, where there's, or malls. I think there was that one, what was it, a neo-Nazi guy that shot up a bunch of Sikhs in a mall a few years ago. So there's all sorts of different locations. But the school shooting, though, seems to be the one that a lot of people focus on. I think presumably because there's children there and they want to tug on the heartstrings of the people when they put the news out. And invariably what happens with a lot of these mass shooting discussions is, well, when are we going to have that, talk about gun ownership? And when are we going to, limit gun ownership even more? And one of the things that, is interesting that a lot of these pundits don't talk about, nor would we expect them to. A lot of these shootings take place in cities, which means that they're blue, which means that they already have very strict gun laws. It didn't seem to do anything in those areas. You don't have like mass shootings in like rural areas, where there actually are lots of guns. It's you have them in areas where you don't have lots of guns, and so that's one element. But I think with regard specifically to the school shootings, and usually shooters who are students that went to those schools or who are still in school but we didn't go to that school. There, I think one thing that deserves to be looked at too is the over medication of children. What impact that has on pathological antisocial behavior leading up to, including, homicide, because we didn't really have this. For example, like in the 50s, when we had still large public schools, we weren't mass medicating kids. And to my knowledge, we didn't have things like Columbine or anything like that in the 50s. So, to what extent is it this mass medication of students that is leading to this? And also, when we look at, say, other aspects, there's also the tendency in the media to paint all the shooters as white. Like, I think it was like 2015, 16, there was the Egyptian couple that were shooters. Everybody said they were white, but then, they're Egyptians. And then they dropped the case. They dropped the story because that didn't serve the narrative interest. The gay bar shooter in Florida, he's a Muslim man. And then they said he was white at first. They said he was Christian at first. It was ridiculous. And then they're like, no, he's a Muslim man. Drop the story. So a lot of this is just, cheap political points. But one of the things with regards to schools, obviously people, you're going to say, okay, well, we need to educate kids. But I kind of wonder, like, why do we have so many kids in one spot? It's almost like, since we have a track record of these things getting shot up, why don't we just distribute the kids out more broadly so they're not such a soft target? It's like, why do we have them all crammed in there like that? Since it already is proven to be a target, why make it that easy for them? Keith.
Yeah, well, there's really multiple issues involved in this. The first thing is, why do we actually have these mass public shootings nowadays as a general sociological phenomenon? Then there's the question of, well, what causes them? Is it something that's unique to contemporary social conditions or something like that? There's also the question of what, if anything, can be done about it. I think the first thing is, when we look at the statistical data on mass shootings, we have to consider how the concept is being defined. Like the common definition among researchers for what a mass shooter is that there's at least 4 victims. But that can mean anything. I mean, that can mean somebody shooting at random in public, like at a school or shopping center or something. It can mean one of these family massacres where it's basically domestic violence gone crazy, or it can mean a gang fight between what amounts to members of organized crime. Any of those can be considered a mass shooting, but it also the motivation and context varies quite a bit. I think what most people are most concerned about are just seemingly random acts of violence by seemingly crazy people, where they go out and just start shooting people in public, people they don't know, people they have no personal quarrel with, or anything like that. School shootings, I think Todd is right, are the ones that get the most publicity because kids are the victims. But this kind of thing happens in shopping centers and workplaces, and there was one that happened at a church recently. In fact, there's been multiple incidents that have happened in the church. So, obviously, people don't want these kinds of things to happen. As far as what causes it, I tend to think that Emil Durkheim's theory of enemy provides at least some explanatory power for this. Back in the late 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was at its peak, Emil Durkheim, who was a French sociologist, had this theory of anomie, anomie, which basically means that people simply become disconnected from anything and are kind of aimless and driftless, and they sort of go crazy as a result. What he was concerned about were the social dislocations of the Industrial Revolution. Like the impact of the Industrial Revolution is that traditional agricultural communities were breaking down and people were migrating towards cities to get jobs in factories and under crummy conditions. And people's traditional, cultural roots and family roots and social ties and all that kind of thing tended to be disrupted in the process. And he was concerned about things like high suicide rates, like suicide rates were increasing during this time period that I'm talking about. Crime was an issue. And Durkheim thought that the more rootless and the more disconnected from things around them people become, the more they sort of go off the deep end, and either they become self-destructive and commit suicide, or become a drug addict or alcoholic, or they become violent and dangerous and harmful to other people. And that seems to be what's going on today. The situation that we have today is very similar to the late 19th century, where it's a time of very, very rapid technological development. It's a time of very, very rapid social change. It's a time of where more traditional cultural norms or whatever are breaking down and being replaced with new ones. People are very mobile nowadays, very transient. People don't really have the community roots or family roots or anything like that is quite as much. Like a lot of people don't even know who their neighbors are. There was that famous book from a few years ago, Bowling Alone, that talked about how people have no community life, no family life. So right now is a time period that's very similar to the late 19th century, and we see some of the same kinds of problems. Suicide rates certainly in the United States are rising, drug overdoses are rising. We have bizarre crimes like mass shootings and things like that. So it seems to be that Durkheim's theory is once again applicable. We're living in a time where a lot of people, for whatever reason, mostly just very far-reaching and rapid changes that are taking place in the wider society, are experiencing enemy. Some people, fortunately, not that many compared to how many people there are, but some people are just going off the deep end.
Yeah, Swithun.
The mass shooter, however you so define it, there seems to be quite a few different sort of types. So looking at some sort of research, and this woman is quoted by loads of people having done research for this, some called Gillian Peterson, along with a guy called James Densley, sociologist and criminologist, who do the Violence Project. I don't know what that is, but they tend to be quoted. They were saying that there's basically 5 broad types of like mass shooting. There's the school shooting, there's the college, university shooting, workplace shooting, house of worship shooting, and the retail restaurant shooting. They seem to be the general places where the mass shooting, which is kind of obvious because there's lots of people there to shoot. It'd be surprising if it was a car park in the middle of nowhere. But that's how they kind of break it down. From looking at the research, it seems like the claim is that there isn't really any one type of mass shooter. They're all very very different, and I imagine though, if you were to look at the breakdown of, like, say, the job workplace shootings and the school shooting, they'd be somewhat different. In certain respects, obviously age. The workplace shooters, unsurprisingly, have disputes with their employer or something along those lines, job right. Typically, they aren't very good at what they're doing and get annoyed and then shoot people. Schools are a little different there. So there's no sort of one type, although apparently the more general assessment of the shooters was that they had 3 things: suicidal motives and life indifference, perceived victimization, and desires for fame. Those were sort of the 3 major characteristics that any of the mass shooters had. Other general things is apparently, which is again probably not surprising, related to any of the violent crime, is childhood trauma, violence as a young age, parental, also things like parental suicide, physical abuse, neglect, domestic violence, bullying, whatever that means. There used to be a narrative of, oh no, all these shooters are somehow mentally ill. But once I think they decided to put white supremacy behind everything, that was kind of a bad move. So that's no longer there. When it comes to the racial breakdown, because everyone always thinks, oh no, it's always white school kids shooting everybody up. If you, this is based on a data set that Mother Jones used from 1982 to 2021. Brief numbers, here we go. Asians, 6 point. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether this is Asian American or Asians and Asians. I imagine it's both. It's not obvious in the data set. So 6.6% of mass shooters are Asian, and they are 3.6% of the population. So, quite somewhat overrepresented, but the sample size is very small. Blacks are 17.4% of mass shootings, whilst only 12.3% of the population. Again, though, that comports with general violent crime stats anyway. Hispanics are only 8.3%, being 12.5% of the population. Apparently, American Indians, 2.5% of mass shootings and 1% of the population. White non-Hispanic, 54.5% of mass shootings, and they are 62.6% of the population. That kind of makes it look like white males are somewhat underrepresented. They're contrary to general perception. So that gives some major sort of breakdowns. What I would like to think is interesting, and this is rarely brought up, certainly not in this context. Looking through a lot of the school shooters, especially the younger shooters, in like the early 20s or in their teens, they cite, whether rightly or otherwise, bullying at schools, and whether or not they were, or to what extent, it kind of looks like that for certain people, they don't like school and school is bad for them. Yet, what we have compulsory attendance laws, which stops people leaving there and doing something useful. Yet somehow this is something that can't be brought up in school shootings. It's like, why not we have fewer schools with fewer kids in there who don't want to be there? That might stop the shootings. They might not be disgruntled. Now, clearly, of course, they could be disgruntled at work and shoot at Domino's or 7-Eleven. I mean, that's of course possible. But when it comes to school shootings, it's like, why is it similar to your study? Like, why is everybody there? I mean, what's the point? Another thing that tends to be there in the background, but again is kind of put away, similar to what I said before, is although it's difficult to tell, I don't know the precise figures, but certainly a large proportion of mass shooters, especially the younger age, have very poor family backgrounds, typically from divorced households, or at least they're not brought up by their biological parents, or not both of them, put it that way. Elliot Rodger was a good example of that, although he was like 22 and that wasn't a school shooting. Though he kind of fits a similar profile to a lot of school shooters, despite not being a school from memory. It might have been. I don't think it was. And again, that's something, so divorce and things that can't be mentioned. And then, as Todd, you mentioned, sort of drugs, prescription ones, but also non-prescription drugs as well. This is something Peter Hitchens has written on extensively. Whenever there's some sort of quote-unquote terrorist attack or whatever. Oh, and on the side, a lot of the terrorist attacks don't really seem to be genuine political violence. They seem to take out random people. They're not actually trying to take out like politicians or, FBI heads. I mean, that happens occasionally, but even those, I don't remember if they were particularly politically. What was it? Julia Gifford was shot. Was it Gifford? A number of years ago. Can't remember what the motivation was for that. But drugs at various different times, cannabis, amongst various other things. Anders Breivik was on steroids of various descriptions. And a lot of them were, and it's generally not heavily reported. The guy who shot up the school, the Hispanic guy, apparently he was on cannabis, and he argued with his mother about that as well. Obviously, drugs will affect people differently, but if you're on hallucinogens and you're generally somewhat dysfunctional, that's unsurprising that might influence your behavior. And also, I believe certain African tribes use various versions of cannabis to take before going into battle to fight other tribes because it made them more aggressive and they fought better and it stilled pain. So those are some what I've gleaned from the general overview of them, and sort of three issues which seems not to be mentioned as much as it otherwise might be.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I think it goes without saying that the ways in which shootings are covered in the United States are mostly pernicious in general. I think we'd probably all agree on that. The media, and the media, including the two major political parties, just reflexively use these mass shootings as opportunities to go on the offensive. There's not much mutual cooperation anymore between Democrats and Republicans to sort of process these events legally or morally or really in any other sense. I think it's important to remember that since 1990, violent crime has decreased considerably in the United States. That might be hard to imagine given how mass shootings are publicized and given the presence of the media and social media. Even places like New York had many violent crime problems, even in more affluent areas like Manhattan. This wasn't just in places like Detroit or East LA or Baltimore. It was a bit more present. So that is just one thing to consider because no matter if you're at some work party or if you're in any sort of social gathering discussing the supposed rise of mass shootings and violent crime, it's really important to remember that violent crime has gone down considerably since the 1990s. Now, just to sort of the report on that is the reported violent crime rate is usually per 100,000 in population numbers, and so in 1990 it was 729.6. Now that was the reports of violent crime per an area of 100,000 in population. That's now around, that's less than 400 now at about somewhere between 380 reports of violent crime per areas of 100,000. So it has gone down considerably. And that's not just coming from places like the federal government, but it's also come from individuals like Rudy Giuliani who, once did specific programs to crack down on violent crime in New York, and this wouldn't happen in other places. I think it was under Garcetti in LA, but it was kind of more of a major city problem than it was sort of a ubiquitous United States problem. But It's also another factor to consider is that assault rifles, interestingly enough, make up a mere fraction of the weapon used in mass shootings. It's primarily handguns and then shotguns, but it's overwhelmingly handguns. Gun owners always cringe whenever the media and politicians use the term assault weapons. This isn't even a real category within the world of gun ownership. I think it's just more of an opportunity used by, more anti-gun leaning folks to create sort of a spooky term to maximize, the effect of either spreading fear or creating support for more anti-gun laws or something like that. They probably wouldn't agree with it being called anti-gun, but I'll just say that for the purposes of for the simplicity of the conversation here. And then one other note is that I learned recently that Anders Breivik, the Norwegian shooter, I didn't know this, but his mother ended up being, for years, was very physically abusive and was allegedly sexually abusive to him as well. And she was apparently this. She was on all sorts of prescription medications, and she ended up forcing him to take many prescription medications. And the father many times tried to win over custody in the court system, but just as it is here in the United States and elsewhere in the West, Norway typically overwhelmingly supports the female in the case of a divorce case. So I always thought that was quite interesting. I mean, it was people were more interested in blaming fascism and white supremacy for the phenomenon of Anders Breivik and the shooting, but in fact, I think it's a bit more complicated in the sense that there's prescription drugs involved, physical and most likely sexual abuse. So that is a fairly sad, but also kind of a multifaceted set of reasons why I think that happened in Norway. So, I always just think it's important to remind people that violent crime has gone down, and you wouldn't think that given just how loud and psychotic the media seems to report on mass shootings. So I think I'll leave my opening comments at that.
Yeah, well, one thing that is very interesting is how, when we look at the category of mass shooting, the one thing that the left always does is, of course, blame guns and saying, well, but you see, what's interesting is this is where they sort of show their mask slipping, right? Because in a lot of other contexts, like say crime, they'll be like, well, it's the environment. We need to fix the environment so that we can then remove the conditions that leave rise to crime. No, so we take care of it up front rather than slap all the rest at the back end. But what do they do as soon as there's a school shooting? Well, they go straight to just take the guns away, which, okay, well, that's, I think, as Machiavelli said in the Discourse on Livy, anyone that seeks to disarm the population has nefarious motives in mind, and that's pretty obvious. But looking at the problem itself, and if we were to take that course that the left would take in any other context, that we look at the underlying causes and conditions. Well, let's first look at schools, and it's something you brought up, Swithun. Yeah, they're terrible. I mean, the libertarian right, of course, has their own set of criticism of public schools. But also the anarchist left has also had its whole set of criticism of public schools. And where those two criticisms agree is that it's there to create a bunch of herd people that are just good workers and good soldiers for the global imperial system. And so it's like, why is the radical left even in favor of public schools if that's all it does and that's their overall criticism of it? And so why don't we work on fixing that first? And also the fact that the conditions under which the kids operate, it's this sort of Pavlovian conditioning with bells. There's a great essay by Bob Black, The Abolition of Work, where he does bring up schools and the workplace with the bell. He calls it the tyranny of the bell. And he says it starts in school. So it's a kind of conditioning for servile obedience. And yeah, of course, young children, young boys are going to object to this. This is just a, inhuman situation to put people in. Yeah, but also, if we look at the personal motivations of shooters, as you pointed out, and a lot of them would say, well, either life is not going my way, or nothing matters, or I have concerns that no one's listening to. Well, given that the left is always like, well, let's listen to the concerns, the rage of the black man, the rage of the Muslim man. Well, why don't we listen to the rage of the white shooter? I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So let's see what's the problem here, or any of the other shooters, the young male shooter. So why don't we have some sort of initiatives in place to try to figure out what social problems are going on in these guys' lives that would lead them to take such drastic measures? I mean, this is just obvious from like a left-wing political social platform, and you never hear this from the left, and it really, I think, tells you a lot about where they're coming from on this topic. But it would be interesting to see what such findings would be, and how any of that would affect it. And of course, as you mentioned, terminal philosophy with the Norwegian shooter Breivik, divorced family, drug abusive mom. This is where the broader conservative social talking point of strengthening families would come into play, finding ways to strengthen families so that these young men grow up in situations where they're not so seriously damaged that they would resort to this. And so it is interesting that the quote unquote political party that is most ready in any other context to look at underlying causes and try to deal with those underlying causes to stop shootings won't do, or not shootings, but let's say crime or poverty or somewhere else, won't do that here. They'll just be like, we'll take the guns away. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, first of all, we know that Mexico has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, and yet cartels are just having, shootouts all over the place. So it doesn't work. The real question is, how do we deal with the underlying social issues? Keith.
Yeah, well, looking at the demographics of these public shooters is interesting because, as Swithun was pointing out earlier, you actually see a great deal of diversity among school shooters in terms of, I won't say just school shooters, I'll say mass shooters or mass public shooters. You see that they come from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. Most of them are men, which is true of crime generally, not just this kind of crime. And they tend to come from, anywhere from lower middle class, working class, up to maybe upper middle class backgrounds. And they're usually relatively young or young to middle-aged men. The motivations can vary. I mean, sometimes it's some kind of cause that they become fanatically attached to, white supremacy or black supremacy, or at one point there were people going around shooting anti-abortion doctors. You had Tim McVeigh that bombed the Oklahoma City federal building. Was it was the guns and of government conspiracies and that kind of thing. So sometimes there's some fanatical cause they become attached to, or sometimes it just seems to not be for any discernible motive. But one thing, though, that I've noticed about all of these cases, like every one of these public shooter types that I've ever come across, I've never come across one that I can recall. Maybe there's some somewhere, but I've never come across any where this was an otherwise normal person who went off and just did a mass shooting. I've never come across a case where they said, yeah, John, the school shooter, he was a good guy. It never really seemed like somebody who'd do something like that. Just really surprised that he went off the way he did. I mean, it's almost always a case where if you go back and you find people who knew any of these guys, they say, yeah, not surprising that one turned out that way. So, I mean, and I think the common denominator with all of these people is that they're just total losers. I mean, these are people that in every area of life seem to be losers. If you never find one that had a decent job, that had any kind of direction in life, that had a girlfriend or had a family or had kids or had any kind of functional family ties, or really had anything going for them in terms of merit or virtue or social connections or anything like that. It's always somebody who's just a total loser. So public shootings, at least the random, I mean, not excluding organized crime and that kind of stuff, but just the random public violence that you see, it's always just seems to be some loser trying to take out their own frustrations on the world. Life doesn't have anything for me, so I'm going to end it all and take as many as I can with me. That seems to be the common denominator. Now, the question is, where do these kinds of people come from? I think it gets back to what I was saying earlier about anarchy at a time of rapid social change, rapid large-scale social dislocation, that kind of thing, lack of social integration and interconnectedness. You just tend to see more personalities like this develop. And that's true in a lot of places. That's not true just in the United States or just today. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that I posted some information about this on Attack the System recently, and also on my Facebook page, where there was some research done a few years ago about the rate of deaths resulting from mass shooting by country. And it's not true that the United States actually has the highest percentage of deaths from mass shootings. I think Norway actually came out at the top, and that's because of the Anders Breivik incident from some years ago. But there's a number of European countries that actually have about 10 or so that have a higher rate of death from mass shootings relative to population size than the United States. Also, as Todd pointed out, if you look at gun laws, a lot of the anti-gun people who say gun control is the solution, they will point to, say, Western Europe, or they'll point to Japan and say, well, they have very low homicide rates or low rates of death by gun violence because they have stricter gun laws. But if you look at virtually every country in the Caribbean or in Latin America, that is virtually everywhere in the Western Hemisphere except Canada, every one of those countries has stricter gun laws than the United States, and virtually all of them have just as high or higher homicide rates. Like countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Colombia, Venezuela, those places have off the charts homicide rates, even compared to the United States. And they also have stricter gun laws. So it seems like that gun laws don't really do the trick either, at least not in particular context. Also, some of the public violence we see today is kind of like what you find in poor third world countries. I've had a lot of students that came from places like Latin America or Africa and places of that type where you have a lot of violence, civil war, and that kind of thing. I had a student once that when she was 7 years old, her mother was killed. She was shot at a market. This was in Africa, one of the African countries. I think it was in Sierra Leone. They just went to the market and somebody showed up and started shooting, and apparently it was some kind of terrorist thing or something like that. But in societies where you have huge disparities in wealth, where you have lots of social dislocation, where you have lots of enemy, this just seems to be a pattern that repeats itself. Also, crime itself tends to come in fads. It's kind of like, everything follows fads, like different styles of music. Nowadays everybody's into hip hop and rap music. It used to be rock and new wave, nowadays you've got certain types of fashions that are popular, and in the past other types were popular, or different models of cars. Well, it seems to be like that with crime as well. Like I posted an article recently about I think on Facebook I posted this, where it was about serial killers, where in the 70s and 80s and 90s we had this big wave of serial killers in the United States, and now that's kind of gone to the wayside. We don't hear much about that anymore. Now it's these public shooters. It's like being a public shooter is now the in style thing to do if you're going to be a mass murderer. Whereas in the past it was more like being a serial killer was, it's kind of like it's like heavy metal was popular one year and disco was popular the next or something. It's crimes go in fads. And somebody told me that they thought the reason that serial killers had in part gone out of style is because it's easier to catch them now, because we have so many surveillance cameras and we have DNA and all that kind of stuff that you didn't have in the 70s. So it may be that some of these people that are now being mass shooters would have been serial killers in the past, but they're just looking for a different outlet. And then as far as the question of what to do about them, that's a big question. It doesn't seem like more gun control by itself is going to be a viable solution. And then there's people who say, like the NRA types, they'll go the opposite direction. They say we need more armed guards in schools. But that hasn't really worked either, because we've had multiple cases now where the school security or the local police just basically sat down on the job when a school shooting was going on. So that doesn't seem to be a solution. I know someone who used to work in the public school system in China, and they were talking about the level of security you have in Chinese schools, where basically you have to have a facial scan to get in. It's under lock and key. It's like going to visit a prison or something. I don't know. That might work as far as preventing school shootings. I don't know what the other effects of that would be. Even if it prevented school shootings, it wouldn't prevent shootings at the shopping center or church or some other where. It seems to me if it was harder to access schools, people that want to do mass shootings would just go somewhere else. So maybe that would be better, maybe it wouldn't. But yeah, so it seems like these are just really complicated topics that there's no real easy answer to.
Yeah, Swithun.
Following Keith's reference to anime, one interesting note in the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto was that he started reading 4chan and other sites on sort of 1488 style topics, was because he was massively bored during lockdown. I think we're safe to say we can say this is partially a lockdown death, which obviously clearly accelerated sort of social disintegration, because being social was basically illegal unless you did it online, which of course is not a great substitute, as Elliot Roger might tell us if he was still here. So, I mean, as to how to solve the problems of mass shooting, I mean, this is a whole social and economic thing that you want to flip over, and it probably would be better. Although one interesting thing here, some of the sort of more hereditarian social Darwinist types will say is, well, proportion, we're probably going to get more mass shooters now because the birth rate of the more well-adjusted and intelligent has gone down, and so basically we're moving towards only those people who are relatively more socially dysfunctional or low IQ types individuals who tend to be more criminal. I think the IQ range for criminality is mostly like between like 70 and 100, like 95 or something like it's below average, but it's not too low, because if you're too stupid you can't commit crime. You can't be that stupid, otherwise you're harmless, essentially. So I mean that's another angle on there with respect to sort of like birth rates. But for relatively kind of simple solutions, I mean, in schools, I mean, Keith had a good post on this. One problem with like getting guards and police to like go out to active shooters, it's like, well, what's in it for them? I mean, they're going to get, at worst, they'll lose their job. Okay, it was a nice job while it lasted. I'm not dead. So to really try and get to pay someone to go in and actually genuinely going to go in an active shooter who isn't already in danger themselves is, can be quite difficult to find those types of people who are going to do it. So, I mean, what you would want to do is to arm people who would have a skin in the game to shoot the active shooter, which would clearly be teachers, school administrators, and some of the kids, probably. I mean, historically, I remember there's articles about shooting ranges at schools in the 1950s, and kids did it afterwards, whatever. So there's no reason. And of course, I don't know if it is in the US, but you can join the military in the UK when you're 16. So it's not as if you can. It's not as if they were completely useless with a gun. And if they're a decent type, they could kind of do it. The other one, which of course is an easy solution but would never fly with the current society, is abolish compulsory attendance laws in schools. Literally abolish it and change the. The problem with that as well is, I mean, you can do that, but then no one will hire kids that much because of ridiculous insurance policies, and that's due to the courts. So the more you dig deeper as to why society makes no sense, you dig deeper until you have some ridiculous judicial ruling, which then changes insurance policy, at which point people start doing retarded things. But I would go on that angle, at least with respect to the schools. On TP's point, though, just on violent crime, in the case of the UK, there's always the argument that it's going down, but I'm pretty sure it isn't to the large extent, because one of my caveats when it comes to violent crime going down is whether it's actually reported or not, and whether or not the police actually bother to investigate it as a crime. Peter Hitchens' work, at least with crime from at least this is over a much longer time period, but say the Second World War period up until today, the prison population is massively higher than it was. And basically today you got to do a lot to try and go to prison in England. I mean, you have to really try hard to go. Whereas back in back in the pre-Second War, I can't remember what time period he cites for this. It might be in the 30s. Like, police would stop people and basically arrest them for riding a bicycle without a light. I mean, this is just like incredibly innocuous stuff. Whereas now, like, you seriously have to be like pretty darn antisocial, unless of course you're confronting a burglar, in which case the police will come immediately because you're violating their human rights where they're trying to nick your stuff. I am somewhat dubious of the violent crime. It may be true in the US, but I would want to be careful that the type of reporting is constant over time, because especially if in a violent neighborhood, you're just not going to even bother reporting it. So whilst it's possible, I'm open to it being true, I am skeptical to what extent violent crime is in fact down, at least certainly from, say, the 1960s.
All right, turn to philosophy.
All right. Well, I don't have too much more to add that's original or that's already been sort of touched on, but I agree with what Keith said earlier in the sense that violent gun crime and mass shootings is there's not just some one easy silver bullet solution to it. I think it's really complicated, and it's sociological, and it's also, it's very much related to family life and intelligence and many things like that. One thing that I think that's sort of frustrating is that, many of the shootings that occur in places like Baltimore and Detroit and East LA, and, it's most of it's just sort of like gang warfare. And, it seems like you don't have to dig too far in Google to find article headlines that say 25 shot in Baltimore, 8 dead, things like that. There's a pyramid of Giza's worth of articles that are titled similar to that in other cities, and it is peculiar to me that is almost universally just ignored by the media, and then whenever it is addressed, it's typically blamed on the legacy of white supremacy that's making young black men do this, and if we just gave them more opportunity, this would cease immediately. And so it's just sort of this frustrating sort of like Band-Aid canned response that doesn't really mean much. I think there's perhaps some truth in the abstract, to the sense that, this sort of leftover, supermajority white nation imposes some sort of system of living on people from sub-Saharan Africa. But that is just, I feel like that loses legitimacy, as most people in the United States, regardless of their background, are sort of culturally Christian, even if you're a so-called atheist or agnostic or anything like that. You're mostly within the sphere of the American suburban or urban life, and so there are many opportunities available right now to many young black men in the urban areas of the country. It's just it's more of lifestyle choices that are preferred over others. And another thing too, I think that is generally true, and this doesn't have anything to do with race. I think it just has to do with general intelligence and perhaps background. But many of the shooters that you see are just generally, as Keith said, just straight up losers and just boneheaded decision making. Just low IQs. And Swithun made that point that I have read that somewhere else too, where the IQ range of violent criminals is somewhere around it's north or south of 70 or 80. So, I mean, you're not working with much there, obviously. And it would appear in places like New York City, and I sort of cringe at the political career and impulses of Rudy Giuliani many times, but to his credit, and not just to him, but to others, with his crackdown on crime in New York in the 80s and 90s, that seems to have had a positive effect. So, and then another problem too is that the divorce rate in the United States is quite high, and especially for Black households. I think the single motherhood households are something like in the it's like 74, 75%. I mean, it's quite abysmal. So clearly something needs to be done about improving family life. And also, I think that, we need to probably stop glorifying violence in the way that it's probably glorified in rap music. I know that almost sounds like some sort of atypical Fox News boomer take on it, but that probably would help a bit. I wouldn't blame I would never dream to blame the majority of it on that, but I mean, that has had some sort of compounding effect since the 80s. And yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else to say other than it's just also important to remember too that assault rifles and not assault weapons, which is some sort of weird fictitious category that the media has just sort of pulled out of their back pocket. They make up, assault weapons only make up a tiny fraction of the overall total amount of gun violence and mass shootings in the United States. It's primarily actually handguns, and again, I don't have to tell anyone here listening or sitting in that pistols in places like Chicago are apparently have been either outlawed or so difficult to get that it's just this paperwork, bureaucratic hell to even get one. But it's extremely easy to obtain a pistol with a filed off serial number anywhere in Chicago. So those are just some of my other additional thoughts.
All right, so we'll be going into the final statements. I'll give you first crack at that, Keith.
Yeah, earlier Swithun alluded to something I posted in another context, where I was talking about the possibility of one way you could potentially stop school shootings would be if you actually had people on site at the school who had an actual stake in taking down the shooter. We see this situation that happened in Uvalde, where you had the SWAT team that just showed up and just kind of stood around, and finally, I think it was somebody from the Border Patrol that went in and took down the shooter. But that's happened in multiple cases. You had a school resource officer at the Parkland shooting that went and hid when the shooting started. That happened at the Columbine shooting. You actually had members of the SWAT team hiding behind ambulances when those shootings were going on. And I think it gets back to what Swithun mentioned, which is that policemen really don't have incentive to stop school shooters. I mean, like in Texas, the average policeman's salary is something like $55,000 a year, and in the United States, that would be about $900 a week take-home pay after taxes. So, how many people are going to go risk their lives for $900 a week? I mean, unless they're super altruistic, and unless they look at it like I am a sworn officer of the law and it's my duty to protect these kids, or somebody that thinks like that, they might go and confront a school shooter. But most people aren't going to do that. Most people, look out for number one first. That's just how things go. But if you had a situation in schools where you had people there who do have powerful personal and psychological incentive to confront a school shooter, like people whose actual lives are in danger, people who are defending their community, their coworkers, their students, their whatever. I do think that could make a difference if you had teachers, school administrators, employees of the school, like janitors or whatever, even older and more with it students who were armed. And if a school shooter showed up, they were able to eliminate the school shooter. And I'm not saying, well, that means you just tell kids start bringing guns to school. I mean, this would have to be something that was organized, and the people involved would have to be volunteers who were trained and and how to use guns and screen for mental health and that kind of stuff. criminal history and that kind of stuff. So it have to be something that's organized and planned. But at the same time, I do think that can make a difference. I mean, the thing is, if one thing about these school shooter types or public shooters generally is that they're typically attacking soft targets. I mean, you don't see that many of these people going and attacking an army base or a police station. Well, you do at times. There have been incidents like that. Usually they were terrorists or, these was politically motivated. But generally speaking, school shooters are attacking folks that don't expect there to be a shooter. You don't really go to church thinking there's going to be a shooting. You don't really go to the grocery store thinking there's going to be a shooting. At school, that's become sort of a stereotype. But so maybe you are expecting a shooting at school. But the shooters clearly view themselves as targeting vulnerable targets or soft targets, not hard targets. So if a school shooter wannabe goes to a school knowing that he is going to be facing immediately, a posse of armed teachers or students or principals or whatever employees, I do think that would be a deterrent. No, I think most of these public shooters think they're probably going to die in the process anyway. This is their moment of glory. So what they're doing is essentially committing murder-suicide. But I think they do want to have the opportunity to get their moment of glory in before they go out. And if they think that's going to be difficult, that may be a deterrent. So I don't know if that would work or not, but it's just an idea.
All right, Swithun.
Well, one thing that a bit different than we've mentioned so far, which is somewhat interesting. Many, although not all, of the school shooters seem to be self-avowed sort of nihilist atheists who treat themselves as one. I think the Columbine shooters had a YouTube username of like a natural selector and other sort of social Darwinist type thoughts. The same thing was true of this is one that's memory hold. The Finnish shooting from I think about 2011 or something. He was similar as well. Now, clearly, of course, you get the Islamic ones who go and blow stuff up, and they think they're going to get rewarded in the afterlife. But it's certainly true of many of the shooters. I don't think they're going to get any sort of post-mortem punishment of any description. Now, whether having a more sort of theist or non-materialist worldview would make much of a difference isn't obvious because, of course, you get, well, I'm going to get glory and then you get 70 virgins or something like that. That's, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, in general, with guns, to solve the problems, my general thought is unless you can somehow make getting in somewhere almost impossible with a gun, it's probably better to have as many people who are good with a gun, because it just means anybody's just a soft target who are in there. I thought that actually, and checking the guns. I was actually interested in going to the Tower of London a number of weeks ago, and I was like doing these bag checks and thinking, well, hang on, like if someone just happens to slip one through, they can shoot loads of people easily. It wouldn't be better if everyone just had one to shoot back. Then I thought the thing is that they actually have soldiers there, so that's kind of slightly better. It's slightly more useful, assuming the soldiers don't shoot people, which would of course be somewhat a problem. So yeah, that's my general take. Unless you can somehow sort of prevent them being in there at all, then you probably better have as many people who are good with them, good people with them. It would be my general solution.
Another thing to your point, the manifest stuff for the Buffalo shooter says he doesn't believe in God or an afterlife. Atheism does seem to be a common theme amongst a lot of these shooters, which, for obvious reasons, the media is never going to report. Terminal philosophy, final thought.
The only other thing I think I'll mention here is that, what Keith said earlier about, the income of police officers. I think it's also, I think it goes without saying that sometimes police work attracts, not the most intelligent people in society either. And that's not to necessarily just bash police officers, but there is, the stereotype of the rather thick police officer that I think, is just an unfortunate sociological phenomenon. One other thing that's related to that is for all of his left leanings and other things, Sam Harris had a good interview with one of his firearms instructors, a former PD SWAT instructor named Scott Reeds. There was a podcast episode he did with him a while ago. It's about an hour and a half. And, it's also important to take into account, just the various amount of responsibilities that police officers had given how short and brief their training period typically is. And so you have to be something like, an on-the-spot legal expert, or at least know the law quite well to enforce it in the first place. You have to be extremely patient with some of the more, undesirable and less intelligent people of society. It's expected that, you're this expert, high pursuit driver. You have to be an absolute deadeye with a pistol or a rifle. Sometimes there have been, out of touch lawyers that have seriously asked cops in court, well, why didn't you just shoot the knife out of his hand, type of a thing, and then, so you have to be this extremely well-rounded person. And then, you have to testify before courts. A lot of the time you're getting up extremely early. You have to process a lot of paperwork for many of the crime scenes that you process. So, and this is all, again, compressed. All of these responsibilities are compressed into typically very short training periods. And so, there either needs to be more of a monetary incentive, or there needs to be a longer and more in-depth training period, perhaps both. But it's hard to retain police officers, and also given the the stigma that the media helps sort of exaggerate on police officers. And there should be processes probably to vet for more highly intelligent, well-rounded candidates in the first place. So I think all of that could probably make policing probably a better thing in the United States in general. Other than that, I'll leave with that.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Philly podcast, signing off.